I'm Jim Falk, and thanks so much for watching. Our founding fathers declared the pursuit of happiness an inalienable right. Yet, does striving for happiness make us happier? Some countries have actually established a Department of Happiness and strive to increase their gross national happiness. Somehow here in the United States, I can't quite see the newly minted U.S. Secretary of Happiness sitting next to the U.S. Secretary of Defense. So what is happiness? And how do we go about achieving it? And why are some countries happier than others? Joining us to share the secrets of happiness is one of our guests who has appeared on the show many times, Eric Weiner. He's the author of The Geography of Bliss and also co-host Vince Poscente, a noted expert on human behavior, author, speaker, and an Olympian. Vince?
Hi, I'm Vince Poscente, and it's my pleasure to welcome Eric Weiner, a seemingly lifelong philosophical traveler, as he describes himself, and also a journalist with NPR, visiting 30 countries. And Eric, you also describe yourself as a grump. So it's fascinating that a grump would be fascinated about the topic of happiness. So really, your book, The Geography of Bliss, I'm curious, why did you write that book? Why did you pursue happiness as a topic? And could you define what happiness is so we have context?
Well, Vince, to answer the first part of your question, why would a grump be interested in happiness? I mean, why would a hungry person be interested in food? They're motivated, and I was motivated. For many years, I was a journalist, as you said, a foreign correspondent for NPR. And it was my job essentially to travel the world in search of the least happy places and the least happy people in these places, victims of war and famine and disease. And it's important work, but it weighed on me. And I had one of those light bulb moments where I thought, well, what if I just flipped that on its head and spent, say, a year traveling around the world looking for the happiest places? What could we learn from them? What could I learn from them? About the good life with a capital G, living the best life you can, the happiest life you can.
This morning when I was shaving, Eric, I got to tell you, I was wondering how you were picking the countries, and I looked in the mirror and I went, Iceland. That felt good. And then I went, Moldova. And that didn't sound so nice. But really, those are two countries out of the 10 you traveled to. How did you select them?
Well, first scientifically, and then with my gut. A little bit of head, a little bit of heart. The head part stemmed from my research at a place called the World Database of Happiness, real place located in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And it's essentially the embodiment of the science of happiness, which you may have heard of, variously known as positive psychology as well. This is essentially social scientists, psychologists, sociologists, and believe it or not, even economists studying not maladies of the human heart, but the positive side, what makes us happy. And they've compiled statistics about not only who's happy, but where they're happy, which countries. And it's a bit surprising. I sort of assumed, Jim, that when I was starting this book, which sounded a bit like a boondoggle, I have to admit, journalist travels the world in search of happy places. I thought I'd be in Tahiti or, places with sandy beaches and drinks with umbrellas in them. But those places do not rank that high scientifically when you look at the happiest places. Tends to be cold, dark places like Iceland, as you said, like Switzerland, like other Nordic and Scandinavian countries, Finland, Sweden. And that's a bit of a mystery, right? We associate happiness with sunshine and beaches. So why are they happy? And the second category was places that, I'll put it this way, I treat the world as a laboratory of ideas, of good ideas. So if you were doing an experiment on happiness and you wanted to isolate a variable, say money, does money buy happiness? That age-old question. Well, what better place to explore that than Qatar, which is one of the, if not the wealthiest places in the world on a per capita basis, and to go there and to find out if they are happy. So I chose these countries for different reasons, but all of them have a lesson for us.
In hindsight, are there countries that you wish you had included and you didn't?
Yes. If I had more time and more money, I probably would have gone to a Latin American country. I do briefly mention what's known as the Latino Bonus, which is the idea that Latin American countries are, I would say, unreasonably happy based on their economic situation. And why is that? I would have gone to Colombia, one of the happiest of the Latin American countries. And given its violent past, I think that would have been interesting. But, it's been said of a piece of writing, it's never finished, only abandoned. And at some point, I had to abandon the book to relinquish it to my editor.
This concept of happiness seems to be more of a solitary type perspective, yet to put science in the equation and studies and data, what have you arrived at in terms of happiness as it means to a country and the geography of that kind of concept?
Well, like you, I thought of happiness before I wrote this book as a solitary endeavor. I would use phrases like personal happiness. I'm working on my personal happiness, the way I'm working on my personal resume and my personal exercise program. But about halfway into my journey around the world, I came to the conclusion that happiness is not personal. I met a man in the country of Bhutan, which I'm sure we'll talk about, named Karma. Great name. Always a good day when you meet a man named Karma. And he said, Eric, happiness is not personal. What are you Americans talking about? It's 100% relational. 100%, he said. And I thought he was exaggerating, but I came to conclude that, in fact, happiness is, as I put it, it's about connective tissue. It's what connects us to others. And it really is, it's a social construct, it's a cultural construct, it's much more of a we than an I.
After reading your book, there was a lot of flashbacks in terms of when I traveled, backpacked around the world, and I found when I went to India, amazing number of happy people. I just went, wait a minute, at home, I'm originally from Canada, a colder climate, but a very unhappy postal service who were going on strike and they were just unhappy. And I was thinking, how is it that these people are happy in India and back home they're not happy with, they've got all these economic advantages?
I'll tell you one of the secrets to happiness right here, if you're ready for it. It's to jettison expectations. That expectations truly are the enemy of happiness. And as Americans, and I'm going to include Canadians in that too as well, we bristle at that. A life without expectations, it sounds like you're just going to be a couch potato and you're not going to do anything. But no, ideally, a happy person is doing a lot and exerting themselves and using their faculties, but their happiness is not pegged to any one particular outcome. And that's where I think especially we Americans, trip ourselves up, is our happiness is pegged to that raise or that promotion or that car. It could be material, could be something social, but it's pegged to an outcome. And that's a recipe for unhappiness, in fact.
Eric, we recently did a program here on McCuistion about envy, the politics of envy. So that's really a problem, isn't it? That's the enemy of happiness.
Yes, I call envy toxic to happiness, and I go to one of the most envious countries in the world, which also, not coincidentally, is statistically the least happy, Moldova, former Soviet Republic, where I found that it's rife with envy. There's a saying there that they'd rather see their neighbor fail than themselves succeed. And this is not how you're going to be happy. Envy, it's been said, of all the 7 deadly sins, is the only one without any redeeming traits whatsoever. Sloth has something to say for it, not envy. And, basing your happiness on how others are doing is going to make you miserable. I guarantee it. America suffers from the unhappiness of not being happy, which is a particularly American malady. Because it's in one of our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, we feel like we should be happy. And if we're not, what the heck is wrong with us? It's another kind of expectation, really not that different from wanting the latest Tesla or the promotion, but instead you're focused on being happy. And the tricky thing about happiness, I discovered, is that it's a slippery thing, Jim. You can't grab it head on. John Stuart Mill, the British philosopher, said that happiness must be approached sideways like a crab. So as I put it in my book, happiness really is a byproduct of a life lived well. So we do these things to live a full life, and then happiness is the pleasant side effect.
Eric, if you could retrace your steps and add a second edition to this or something along those lines, what would you find? What would you explore? And let me just add that piece of, since then, social media has created this wave of seeming discontent. What's your take on that, and what would you find if you retraced your steps?
Well, let me answer the second question first about social media. Social media is essentially an envy-producing machine or machines. Instagram, Facebook, they're all essentially, if they're not designed, they certainly have the effect of making you feel like you are not as beautiful as that person on Instagram, or as wealthy as that, or happy as that person, your friend who just posted on Facebook. So from a psychological perspective and a positive psychology perspective, they're a terrible idea, because they're just increasing our envy and therefore our unhappiness. As far as retracing my steps, I think I would find that not that as much has changed as you might think. Happiness is, it's like an oil tanker or a cruise ship. It changes course very slowly and with great effort. So it takes a lot for a happy place to become less happy, and it takes a lot to take an unhappy place and make it happier. I would say that if I could go back and do this again, I might, as I sort of hint at the end of the book, broaden my definition of happiness away from the way we define it, which really is almost, not quite, almost synonymous with pleasure, and take a view that really the ancient Greeks took, which is that happiness is about flourishing. Eudaimonia was the ancient Greek word for happiness, but it's not really happiness. It's a full, complete, meaningful life, and that I think is the key.
Eric, certain Asian religions, especially Buddhism, Hinduism, put such emphasis on the afterlife, reincarnation. How does that play a role in group collective happiness?
Well, I think it takes some of the pressure off, don't you? If you don't get it right in this life, you've got
several more chances
to try. Yeah, this "you only live once" saying puts a lot of pressure on us. And whenever you're putting pressure on yourself to be happy, you're going to be unhappy. So I'm in favor of anything that takes the pressure off of us to be happy. I think it's not only a belief in reincarnation that might lead to, I would say, greater serenity. I would use that word among followers of Buddhism and Hinduism. It's also this notion I talked about freeing yourself of expectations. There's a line in the great Hindu poem, the Bhagavad Gita, where essentially Lord Krishna says to Arjuna, you have the right to your effort, but not the fruits of your labor. And essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, put 100% effort, invest 100% into every single thing you do, and have precisely 0% invested in the results. And to the extent that people from Eastern countries can follow that advice, I think they're bound to be happy.
The big question is, the interplay between economics and happiness. You kind of referred to it a bit earlier. Could you dive into that a bit more? Because it just seems to be, if you got more money, you're in a place where you could be more happy, but that's really not the case in all cases.
Is it the case for you?
Well, it makes a difference, but it's not the end game, right? It just seems to be, if there's bills or debt collectors are calling or something like that, then it's right. Like, gosh, get me out of this.
What's true for individuals like yourself and for nations like Canada or the US is that a little more money when you're really broke will make you a lot happier. But a lot more money when you already have a lot won't move the needle very much. It's known as the Easterland Paradox, named after a professor of economics at UCLA. And essentially he looked at the statistics around the world and individuals and found that, as you get wealthier, you get happier and happier. It's a pretty steep climb from poverty. But then you reach a point, a plateau, not that much money actually, where more increases in wealth yield only the tiniest fraction of a boost in happiness. So, this notion of just the happy poor person is largely a myth. We do need a certain amount of money to be happy. That's true for nations as it is for individuals. The least happy countries in the world are sub-Saharan African nations for, I think, obvious reasons. But once you reach a certain point, you individually or as a nation, what worked before doesn't work anymore. More money doesn't make you happier. It's other aspects of life, like we've been discussing, the social glue that holds people together, fulfilling pastimes, worthwhile projects. Those really kick in at that point. The least happy countries in the world are sub-Saharan African nations, but close behind them in the unhappiness department are the former Soviet republics. And that's, on the face of it, a bit of a mystery because after the breakup of the Soviet Union, they gained a lot more freedom and somewhat more money, but their envy also increased. Their expectations increased. And they began to compare themselves, not to other Soviet republics, but to quite wealthy and democratic Western democracies. And who we compare ourselves to matters a lot.
And they thought it would turn around right away. Well, another issue, of course, that's been on our minds for the last, God, it's hard to believe this, 20 months, coming up to 2 years, is COVID. How has that affected countries' happiness?
Well, the early data indicates surprisingly not that much, not as much as you'd think. There hasn't been a dramatic drop in happiness, and as far as I know, in really any country in the world. There's been a dip down, but that's about it. And that is the thing about happiness. It takes a lot to deplete it once you've got it. It takes a lot to amass it if you don't have it. And one thing I learned, and this is not from COVID, but from the financial meltdown in Iceland, which happened shortly after I visited there by coincidence. And I had assumed when I read about banks failing and real economic hardship there that, oh no, this happy country I visited is no longer happy. And I shot off an email to an Icelandic friend there. And I said, what's going on? Are people miserable? And he said, essentially, no, that, it's tough, no doubt about it, but people are sticking together. And that social capital that they had during good times, they could dip into during bad times, during the rainy day. So I guess what I'm saying here is that the ingredients that make a country happy, I think also make it resilient during crises like COVID or financial upheavals.
The recent study had us in the United States at 19th on the ranking of happiness. So let's kind of dive in. You've talked a bit about expectations. Are there any other things as solutions for us to, being a competitive nation, to climb that list?
Yeah, when I cite that statistic, and it's been around 19, 18, for many decades now in the global rankings, people are surprised. Americans are surprised. They think, aren't we number one? Or, we're the biggest economy, we should be the happiest. So it is partly this expectations game that we play. We consume more self-help books and books on happiness. And really, you should just read mine, but we consume all these and yet we're not happy. And part of the problem is the expectations game. Another problem that I think is really key to a happy place is trust, right? So trust, I found, is common to all of the world's happiest places. And in the US, you've seen really a decades-long decrease in trust. Back in the 60s, they presented this little thought experiment to the man on the street and said, overall, do you think most people can be trusted? Open-ended question, but 2/3 of the respondents said, yes, overall, I think most people can be trusted. They repeated the question 3 or 4 decades later and it had flipped. 2/3 of the respondents said, no, overall, I don't think most people can be trusted. And I think that explains a lot about why America's number 19 on the list and not higher. We don't have a high degree of trust.
And that seems to be disintegrating, the trust quotient.
Seems to be heading in the wrong direction. I would say, though, that happiness is somewhat tied to the political situation, but not that tightly. If you think about, for most people outside the Beltway, at least, their sources of happiness are friends, family, other people. It's not necessarily what their congressman or woman is up to. So, I think you can have a happy country that is not a fully functioning democracy. I think it's easier if it is a democracy, and I think the happiness you achieve in a democracy is, let's put it this way, richer and more satisfying.
Eric, I'm holding this report from Gallup that measures happiness with 149 countries, and it measures specifically these 6 areas. I'll go over them real quickly: gross domestic product per capita, social support, healthy life expectancy, freedom to make your own choices, generosity of the population, and perceptions of internal or external corruption levels. Would you agree with how they measure that, and what are the areas that we in the United States really need to focus on?
Well, I would say those are good ingredients for happiness. I wouldn't say, and I don't think this is what Gallup does, you don't measure all these things and then determine what the happiest place is, because the tricky thing about happiness is it is subjective. And in fact, researchers studying happiness don't call it happiness, they call it SWB, subjective well-being. So the way they measure happiness in any country, or if I were to measure your happiness, I would ask you, Jim, overall on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you these days?
I think I would say a good 8 to 9 right now.
Okay, so that's good. That puts you happier than the average American. But again, I asked you to assess subjectively, not at this moment. Maybe you had, a bad cup of coffee this morning and it's not sitting well with you, but you're assessing overall in your life, how happy are you? Now, then we could look at the aspects of your life the way Gallup looked at the aspects of societies. Would hope there's not endemic corruption in your life, but you never know. What's your income level? What's your physical health? That's a factor. And all those matter, but ultimately it's you, Jim, deciding how happy you are. And so that's why you see these disparities sometimes, the Latino bonus. Latin American countries, not that wealthy, but disproportionately happy, because they're taking those same ingredients and they're interpreting them differently. And it's this interpretation of our circumstances that really determines our happiness, not the circumstances themselves.
So trust, expectation, is there anything else that we can, in this period of self-reflection, be able to have more happiness as we move forward from this interview?
Yeah, I would say nature, what the naturalist E.O. Wilson calls biophilia, which is essentially a fancy word that means nature makes you feel good. And there have been many, many studies about this. And I did find that all happy places, even if they were, if I was in a city, these were cities with access to nature, lots of parks and clean rivers. And the Swiss, one of the happiest countries in the world, they feel a real connection to the land and to the mountains, the Alps. So spending time in nature would certainly be one. And I would say finding meaning in life. And this is where the science of happiness and the science of flourishing they overlap a lot, but not 100%. You can lead a meaningful life. It's not exactly the same as a happy one, certainly not the same as a pleasurable one. But I think spending time in nature, finding meaning in life, cultivating trust, eradicating envy wherever possible. These are all ways that you can personally make yourself happier, if not the entire nation.
Arthur Brooks, who recently retired as president of the American Enterprise Institute, now has a podcast and a column in the Atlantic magazine. And he says that you can develop healthy, happy habits. I think that's what you're saying, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the first happy American in my mind was Benjamin Franklin, and he came up with a list as a young man of 13 virtues in a little notebook, and he was going to check them off and keep track of them. Some were industry and frugality, but also sincerity and other virtues. And basically, Franklin was in the habit business, the happy habit business. And, that is one thing we can control. We can't control these big tectonic events happening around us. We can do our bit to combat climate change. We can vote, but a lot of life is outside of our control, and it's coming to terms with this uncertainty that I think is one of the keys to happiness.
Well, I have to say, Eric, it is always fun to talk with you, and just listening to you has made me less grumpy. And I hope the fact that you've been on the McCuistion program, I think for the third time, that you're going to have a happy day. And
I think if you're less grumpy, you might be shooting for a 9.5 or 10 by now.
Exactly. Jim. But I hope everyone's enjoyed the program. And what we really try to do here is not always talk about some of the heaviest topics, but to give all of our viewers an opportunity to reflect on their life. And I hope after today's program, you'll think about some of the things that you might do to build those happy habits so that we can all reach, as we go into the holiday season, a good solid 9 or 10. We bring different perspectives to all of your views. And here at McCuistion, we're talking about things that matter with people who care. Follow us on McCuistionTV.com, your favorite social media, and we'll see you back here very soon. Thanks again for watching.